All right, I'm live and I'm here with Richard Brice, and it's me, Bill Patton, Infinite Vision Coach. And this is going to be a rarity because I'm on with Richard, who I've never really had a conversation with at length. And we also don't have a script for the discussion tonight. But the topic is the vestibular system. And it's incredibly fascinating to me, and I know almost nothing about it. And Richard is quite versed in it. So just a little background before I introduce Richard and let him introduce himself more. I became acquainted with you, Richard, on Instagram because I was seeing these posts, you know, where you're doing these vestibular exercises, and some of them are very much connected to the visual system. So that immediately caught my attention. But then I realized, okay, I have almost no idea what you're doing. So I've got to learn about this because of one of the themes that we're going to cover in this talk, which is sort of the interconnectedness of everything. So, Richard, why don't you start by telling us where you are and what, you know, where you coach, and a little bit about how you got started, you know, down this road of looking into the vestibular system.
Yeah, hey, nice to meet everyone. So I'm based in Vancouver, Canada. I don't coach anymore. So I used to coach a while back. I did that for a number of years, but for the last 10, 12 years, it's more been working with tennis players on the training side of things. So as a trainer, I've worked with all levels of player. I've run a number of different performance programs, one back in the UK and then one over here in Canada. Worked with a lot of rec intermediate players. I've got a chance to work with a few professionals, plenty of college hopefuls, decent juniors, but that was all with the, or more recently, all with the training side of things. Mm-hmm. So my learning process was really twofold. It was to help my clients, help the people that I was working with, and also to help myself. The quick version is I grew up playing tennis, I grew up playing soccer. They were my two main sports. I had a ridiculous amount of injuries. So it was a big, long 17-year quest to try and learn how to not be injured so I could try and play and compete at tennis and hopefully compete at the Masters. So now what I do, part of that learning process got me involved with neurology. So it was to try and rehab an injury and to rehab a concussion from a mountain bike crash. And as I rehabbed that, the pain started to disappear from my body. The injury issues resolved, and I got a heck of a lot better at tennis. And what I realized was that a big part of the problem and the reason that I'd kind of not progressed past a certain point in tennis was that my visual system just didn't work well enough. So, you know, I practiced, I played, I'd worked hard, I tried coaching, I tried different things, but my timing was always off and it prevented me from improving. That started to change when I started to train the vision. So then I started using it with other players and learning more about the neurology and using all that with other players as well, and started getting good results there. So that's the quick version and where I am now.
Yeah. I mean, you know, that was some good detail, and it didn't feel like it took forever. So thanks for making it nice and tidy there. Yeah. Well, sometimes people go on a little too long with their own introduction. So, but no, that was very tidy. I appreciate that. All right. So now, you know, I've seen you doing some exercises, and if somebody's not really knowing what is the vestibular system and how did you first discover your first set of exercises and your entry into that? What was that, the beginning of that?
So the vestibular system is the balance system. It lives inside the inner ear. So it's kind of like fingernail size embedded in the bone, and it's your balance system. Its job is to tell you which way is up relative to gravity. Its job is to detect movement, so movement of the body relative to gravity, movement of the head. It's got a number of functions, but one of the big ones, there's a reflex that keeps your eyes locked on a target as your head moves. So obviously in tennis, that's going to be a pretty important reflex. I learned about it as part of my rehab process. I took training from an amazing doctor called Dr. Eric Cobb. He's got a company called Z Health. anyone who really wants to go in deep, I highly advise learning from him. He's one of the best in the world. So that's where I got introduced to it initially. I've since taken or studied under other doctors as well, but he was my first introduction and responsible for most of my education on that front.
Okay, so what was the earliest exercise that you remember having an effect for you, a training effect that made a difference?
It's really hard to say because I did a few things all at once. When I learned about applied neurology, I went, okay, let's do it. So I started doing kind of coordination-based training to target different brain areas and vision training and vestibular training. And I did them all at once. And 4 or 5 weeks later, I was a very different person, and I've never been that person since. So it was hard to pinpoint one thing. And probably the reason that I got such good results was because it's all integrated.
Okay. So
every system works together.
I'm going to try it a different way then. Which is the first exercise that comes to your mind?
Looking at something and turning your head. So if I remove my thumb, I'm going to look at the camera lens. And as I look at the camera lens, I'm going to turn my head. That's the vestibular ocular reflex. So that's the reflex that keeps your eyes focused on a target as your head moves. So that's the kind of the most foundational training exercise.
Okay. And so now this is where I want to jump off from that and say that that approximately 30% of your visual experience comes through your eyes right now. And the rest of it is stored in your brain and is in your imagination, so to speak. So let's take hitting a target, for instance, because if you're really truly going to hit the ball well, then most of your attention needs to be with the final phase of the ball strike, which means you're now no longer able to see the target directly, but in your imagination, you know where it is, because, and this is something that I do, and within a matter of minutes, I can get a player to point directly at the target, even though their eyes are trained towards contact. So how does that figure into this? Is it there's a kind of a pairing of that, or what's your thought on that?
So the vestibular system is paired to eye movements. There's literal wiring and connections that deal with it. So as you turn your head to the right, the eyes move to the left. So the right side vestibular system is paired with the muscle on the inside of the right eye and the muscle on the outside of the left eye, so that as I turn my head to the right, it keeps my eyes focused on that target. So that's the kind of the connection in terms of the eye movements. And then if you want to just think about the vision side of things, you've got focused vision, which is that 5 degrees when you're looking directly at something. And then everything that you can see outside of that is your peripheral vision. The closer into that focused vision you are, the more detail you can see, and the better you can track movement. The further out, the less detail. But that peripheral vision is still really good for detecting movement. So if you're looking directly at that contact point, or in theory looking at directly at the contact point, the closer you can line your eyeballs up to that, the better the quality of the peripheral vision that's going to be detecting the movement in either direction.
Yes, and it's a small thing, but I had thought that it was 3 degrees. 3 degrees. So I don't want to start an argument, but it's still very small. But so I don't want to argue about that. But all right, well, that's really interesting. Okay, and so then when pairing this vestibular system with the visual and then going outward towards other exercise, where do you go outward from there?
When you say outward, what do you mean?
Whatever you think I mean.
It's just
what would be the
easier.
next logical exercise to move into in order to facilitate, expand on the skill that you just worked on by turning your head?
So there's lots of different progressions and variations of that. So obviously sitting here looking at it is the most basic form. Then to be able to do that moving, and that's going to start to challenge things more. Working on doing that at different distances is all going to progress the same skill. Another very useful training exercise is to try and pair your head up with a moving target. So you can use your thumb, you can use another target, because at the final stages of tracking the ball onto the racket, it's a lot of head movement. So if you're hitting your forehand, as you go to hit the forehand, your head is turning, your body's turning. So training the system in that way is, I consider that equally as important as just the straight VOR.
That's great. And yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit more too, because I think there's this magazine called Wired. Are you familiar with Wired magazine? They have a feature that says wired, tired, fired. So if you're wired, you know what's coming down the road. If you're tired, you're still using the stuff from, years ago, but it still works, but it's tired. And then if you're using 5 years or 10 years ago's ideas, then you're fired because you haven't kept up. So I'm going to say that, some of these old school teachings that people have said since the cows come home, keep your eye on the ball, watch the ball, that's fired. And then, and then tired is, keep your eyes at contact. It's because I think what happens is I think people unwittingly don't realize that when people attempt to keep their eyes at contact, that you get this rigidity, that, this forced, eye contact at the contact point, and then it leads to all this other tension throughout the body, and so it's not really a best practice. But then wired would be allowing some motion, but obviously the greater economy of motion of the head is going to also then facilitate clearer vision of the eyes. It's kind of a quick statement. Yeah. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's complicated. It's maybe tricky, and there's no one size fits all. So in my mind, I still think, yeah, people should watch the ball. People should keep their eye on the ball. But maybe that's just because I had it said to me a million times when I was growing up. But I think there's no one size fits all to try and get someone to do what they need to do to make the best contact possible, because people are different, I think, is the way I would look at it and answer it.
Oh, absolutely. And, I've been quoting this ad nauseum, but Dr. Cheryl Calder, who's perhaps the, preeminent expert in visual performance for athletes right now, has tested 100,000 athletes and found no two with the exact same strengths and weaknesses in their visual skill profiles. So absolutely underlining what you just said. So yeah, I mean, that's a really big thing to me. And now, so when we go to what are common problems, what are slightly less common problems, what are rare problems, when you're working with athletes, what's the most common problem that you're helping with?
I guess I normally test things in a certain order, or teach people to test things in a certain order so they get identified quickly. One of the first ones is issues with convergence, just because it's such an easy test to introduce people to. So just tracking a target as it moves in. Can the eyes converge, so fully look inwards together? Really easy test to do, and very few people do it well. And I've worked or tested quite a number of tennis players, and it's only a small percentage that can actually fully converge, and an even smaller percentage that can do it smoothly and evenly. So that's the first one that springs to mind.
Let me break in on that one for a second. Do you have any written content that people can read up on this stuff? Because I think there's another guy out there who's written about convergence and other eye exercises. So I went through and I did that, and I found convergence to be quite difficult at first. So it took me some time to get that right.
I used to have written content on my previous website. So depending what it was that you found, it could potentially have been that, because I had a couple of bigger articles talking about it, but I took it down when I launched my more recent site. So not anymore. It's all video format.
All right, great. And so convergence, and then?
Suppression, again, another very easy test. So whether the eyes are camera lenses, ideally both of your eyes are going to point at the same target. That light information then goes back and it gets interpreted by the brain. Depending what's going on, the brain is supposed to be able to use both of those images to create what you see. Sometimes the brain isn't able to use both of those images evenly, and you get what we can call visual suppression. So the brain kind of has to choose one of the images, and that's going to be a really important skill for depth perception, and convergence is also important for depth perception. So I generally start testing those two with everyone because they're so easy to do, and because, you know, depth perception is it's just a staple for being able to time the ball. If you can't accurately judge distance, it's impossible to time the ball well on a consistent basis. So those are the first two.
Okay, and how do astigmatisms play into that? And let me just give my definition of an astigmatism, and then if maybe you can correct me. But my understanding is that your eyes, because of irregularities in the shape of your eye, they focus in different directions. So it takes effort from the eye to bring those focal points into easier alignment, and then usually it's better done by wearing glasses or contacts. Is there more you'd like to add to that?
No, just that things can get complicated. You know, not everyone's born equally. You know, people are tall, people are short. Some people have got slightly different shaped eyes. Stigmatisms can create problems, and one of the things that they can create problems with is visual suppression, because if one of the eyes really isn't functioning optimally and the other one is, then it kind of makes more sense for the brain to pay more attention to the one that's functioning more optimally. So again, it's one of those, there's no one size fits all. It can get complicated. What I would say is I've worked with, you know, more than one person that had been told that issues had been caused by astigmatism, and then we were able to change it. So, you know, sometimes people get told things.
Yeah, I think I understand that. And this is why I think it's wise for people to be consumers of their own information and decide for themselves in regard to their own path of discovering what works for them. And that's why I'm talking with you, because this is an uncharted territory for me. A funny thing happened. I was in the midst of writing the second edition of my book, and I was driving home from Los Angeles at night, and I was starting to see things, and I was like, uh-oh, something is seriously wrong. So I went to the eye doctor, you know, thinking I was going to be told some horrible news, you know, and then he just cheerfully said, oh, you just need glasses. And it was a relief. And then it was very interesting to me. I think I was probably 5 years overdue to get glasses. And then when I got them, then there were leaves on trees again. And I understood what the big deal about, HD TV. I understand what that means now. So it is interesting how, though, you know, solving those issues is really important. So do you want to dig a little bit deeper from convergence to suppression, and then go a little deeper into more visual exercising and training?
So we should probably just add a third one to it, because we've talked about it so much already, and that's the vestibular ocular reflex. It is broken on a lot of people, and when I say broken, they try and keep their eyes on something, and then the eyes lose the target, and they try again, and their eyes lose the target.
Squirrel.
Yeah, this is going to be a major issue for a lot of things, but, you know, keeping your eyes on the target on a tennis court.
That's interesting. And so is it because it's not trained, or is it a natural reflex? It's sort of unnatural until you learn how to do it, or is it a sign of the times, or?
So, you know, everything's controlled by brain areas. We are the sum product of everything that's happened in our lives up until now. So I played a lot of contact sports. I had a lot of concussions, a lot of blows to the head. That stuff, you know, is very well known for not being good for your visual system and not being very good for the vestibular system. So that sort of thing can happen. People can get in car crashes. They can fall over skiing. They can fall over sliding in softball or something. These things shake the brain around. The brain is kind of strong in a way. It's amazing what it can do in terms of adapting, but there's also things that can start to work less optimally. So, sometimes it's just a case of, you can have more serious problems, but a lot of the time it's just a case of kind of switching on areas of the brain that deal with different things to get them working again. And if tennis, there is a lot of movements. It is going to kind of activate different things, but sometimes you just need to be a little bit more specific and targeted to get things working again.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And in my lifetime, I know I've had 4 really good concussions, and one of them in 2010 changed the course of my life because it was a full blown. I mean, my head was at an angle in a car accident, and so then my brains didn't slosh around evenly on the inside. They were knocking into things they're not designed to knock into. So I had a 6-month recovery just to be done with migraines and feeling foggy and loss of emotional control and all that. So that took some time to come back from. And it definitely affected my tennis playing. That is absolutely certain. So, all right. So now if we go more into now the physical exercises of different ways to support that through different motions in your body, what are some of those exercises looking like?
Yeah, I mean, the actual vision training itself, it can be simple, it can be complex. There's different visual skills, but a lot of the time you're going to start with the eye movements. I'm preaching to the choir when it comes to you. You've got different muscles that create the eye movements. We've effectively got slow, smooth tracking exercises, then we've got fast switching exercises. So on its most basic level, you want to be training kind of multiple different directions. We normally talk about the 8 points of the compass, smooth motions and fast switches. There's also different parts of the brain that are responsible for creating those eye movements. So we're targeting the eye muscles, we're targeting the nerves that supply those eye muscles, and then we're working on the different brain areas that create the movements. So the most basic exercises to start with most people are going to be fast and slow eye movements, plus that convergence where you're tracking a target that moves in and out, and then switching between things that are up close and in the distance. And those 4 exercises are going to take a lot of people a long way if they haven't been using their system to its maximum for a while.
Yeah. No, you're reminding me that I have a client who's a neuroscientist, and she testifies in court about and talks with insurance companies about brain function. And she almost slipped. She almost said something wrong. She said, yeah, well, we know where in the brain. And then she said, no. And I was like, yeah, that's wrong. That's wrong. No, we don't. But it is interesting how there are certain parts of the brain that might be more prone to house a certain function. But if that area is injured, then those functions migrate to different parts of the brain. They can. Maybe it works not as well. Maybe it just needs to be trained. It's so mysterious when it comes to that. Yes. So
we're just beginning to learn how the brain works. So everything is taken with a pinch of salt. There's studies where they can kind of see blood diffusion in the brain. They can, based on those, and they get people doing different tasks when they're in these scans, and then based on that, they're kind of piecing things together. But everything is taken with a pinch of salt because it's the science just isn't there yet.
Well, and you can derive general statements of what you think is true and then test those out on people and see if it's valid for them or not.
For sure. Yeah.
Sometimes I will try things on some theories on to people, and then they say, oh yeah, that nailed that. And then sometimes they go, no, I don't really think so. I think it's more like this. So at least it starts a conversation, and we can start to discover, how people use their own brain. I know I've had some clients that, will be working on a certain thing, and it works with about 85% of my clients. And, they'll start looking frustrated. I'm like, I don't think you like this particular thing that we're doing. And what it is, it's when you say bounce when the ball bounces and hit when you hit it. And
Hmm.
there's a certain subsection of people that their verbal processing skills are, not their strength. And so the energy that it goes into producing the words actually inhibits their ability to see the ball. But that's it's less than 15%, but I've learned not to push it with those people. Some people just say, no, this doesn't work for me. In fact, I hate it. So yeah, it is interesting that
Very cool.
there are no general one size fits all things. So what's one of the things where it took you a while to figure out a certain person, and you kind of went through a couple different diagnoses, and then all of a sudden you arrived at your ha-ha moment that it was something a little bit off the beaten path?
I mean, firstly, just to make sure I stay in my lane, I never diagnose stuff. I don't work in that capacity.
Oh,
So
well, okay. No,
I give
I don't mean
thoughts.
by medical definition of, yeah, but more like an auto mechanic, not a medical doctor.
I've worked with a lot of complex cases. So everything that you're trying to get working it's like kind of trying to find the right key to fit the lock. Brains are complicated, so you approach things based on a logic and analysis. You do a bunch of different assessments for different areas of the brain, so you get an impression for what you think someone needs to do, and then kind of based on the wiring and basically just the neuroanatomy, you start to apply stimulus. So that could be an eye drill, it could be a movement drill, it could be a breathing drill, because there's lots of different things that go on, and then you test to see if it gives you the response that you want. So for that convergence issue, you might be able to help a tennis player get the convergence, to get the eye doing more like it should by working on convergence. Or that might not work. Potentially, you might need to apply some sound into one of the ears, because as you've just said, there's different parts of the brain do different things. There's a lot of redundancy, which means things do more than one thing. Sometimes you might need to do a shoulder exercise where you're working on shoulder flexion, because the part of the brain that's responsible for shoulder flexion, just because of our gait and our walking posture, is also the part of the brain where the nerve that controls the eye that moves inwards lives. So
Wow.
there's lots of options to get stuff working.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of cases where when someone hears a certain sound, then they also see a color. Or when they hear a word, then a color appears. Or they hear something and then a word flashes in their mind. So, yeah, a lot of strange things. One of my favorite ones was a girl, very creative young lady, very artsy. And, I was modeling strokes for her. And she said, "Oh, it's like spreading icing on cupcakes." and I know I was stunned like you were, and I stopped and I went, "Yes, very large cupcakes."
It is to you, yes.
So yeah, I mean, that was fresh material, fresh content, but participating with our students to discover how it is they see, and knowing always that they're going to see differently than we do. They could be similar enough that it's relatable, but then maybe it's significantly different. I have my student who is the neuroscientist. She has a very different way of learning, and she actually tells me that I can only give a certain number of instructions, and that she's then going to be very busy for the next 5 minutes, digesting that piece and really paying full attention to that one aspect. So I do not have permission to give any further instructions, so that she's got her, all of her brain power into that. Whereas, many other students are more flexible in that way. So, all right, now, what's another important thing for a tennis player to, look at and understand about their vestibular system, thinking even more at a higher level, more of a intermediate, advanced, high performance? And we just got a comment from AJ Chavria, who's quite quite the guy. He says, "Brilliant stuff, gentlemen." So thank you for that, AJ.
Thinking on a higher level, there's different ways that you can kind of think about it. The vestibular system controls spinal extension, so it's a pathway between the balance system in the inner ear and the control of your spine and your posture. So I guess something for a lot of people to consider. A lot of people get pain when they're serving. There's a lot of head movement going on when people serve. Now, people think that maybe it's something going on the back, but I've done quite a lot of this, and very often you can address those pain problems, those injury problems, by starting to work on the vestibular system. So that's one of the big applications.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
you know, if
rotation
we
on shots as well.
If we were going to stop and look at what was formerly known as the big three, but which has now been reduced to the dominant one.
Amazing player.
Yeah, because Djokovic just took the game to a completely different level. Anyway,
it's unbelievable.
In case you didn't notice, but no, if we compare the three of them, I think it's really interesting to me in this topic to look at them because you've got Nadal, who's maybe his greatest asset is his extreme pain tolerance. So he can put his body through these enormously grinding bad positions, but his pain tolerance allows him to do that. So he's been going against the rule of his vestibular system. And then you look at Djokovic, who's the fighter pilot among them. So he is able to go into the widest range of motion while still maintaining some semblance of balance and coordination.
He's amazing.
Right? And then you have Federer, who just has the visual skill to always arrive exactly on time, perfectly on balance, right? I mean, and I think that's what makes the Nadal-Federer matchup so enthralling, is that Nadal is the greatest ever at throwing people out of position, and Federer is the greatest ever at getting into position. So what do you think? Is there more you want to expand on about those descriptions of the three players?
I mean, they're all superhuman. There's nothing, I'm sure there's nothing that I can say that hasn't already been said about them. I guess the perspective that I think about Djokovic, he seems to take it to another level. You know, I know his wife has talked about how often she just finds him stretching on the floor. He just does it constantly. But I know that he works a lot on his breathing as well. He's worked with a guy called Wim Hof, who's a pretty famous breathing guy. So I know that he explores that. He's obviously doing a lot with his vision. He takes his nutrition to the nth degree. So Djokovic, to me, it seems from the outside that he's kind of got really where he's got to now, just by exploring every possible avenue that there is. You know, I don't know whether the other two do that because we haven't necessarily heard about that information. But he seems to take it one step further, and you know, maybe that's a big part of his why he can do what he does, and you know, relatively few injuries, despite a crazy amount of tennis being played.
Yes, no, it's truly amazing. And then, you know, and yeah, I think it's fascinating that he took what was a relative weakness because he was having, you know, the breathing issues in his career. And, you know, I'm just going to spitball for a second and say that I believe that could possibly be connected to some sort of trauma in his life. Sometimes it is a mental and emotional thing. And so whatever it was, whatever the cause is, or whether it's just genetic or what have you, but to, instead of run from it and say, oh, this is a permanent thing that can't be fixed, to actually dig into it and say, okay, I'm going to work on this and shore up this weakness. So are there connections to breathing from the vestibular system?
Everything's connected. So the vestibular system, we've got if don't know whether people are familiar with what nuclei, but just think collection of brain cells that do something. We've got 4 vestibular nuclei that all have slightly different functions. Between those 4, they live in 2 parts of the brainstem, and we've got 3 parts of the brainstem. Sorry, I can only explain it by explaining it. We've got a bunch of different nuclei that deal with breathing. So there's some shared brain real estate that deal with the breathing and that deal with the vestibular system. So they're heavily interconnected via brain areas and then via the vagal nerve. And there's a bunch of different things going on.
Yes. Wow. No, that's heavy. That's heavy. Is there more that you can explain on that? It sounds like you're trying to spare me.
I can add a little bit about Djokovic's nutrition, because again, from the outside, it seemed like a lot of that stuff cleared up when he went off gluten. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily fully buy into the gluten thing, but when you start to read the research, and I've read a couple of hundred papers on gluten, it's definitely a real thing, and it causes a lot of people problems. Basically, for a lot of people, it can create inflammation, and one of the things that inflammation can do within the body and in the brain is stop energy production. So it stops sufficient energy production. Mitochondria are, energy powerhouses that produce energy within the body. They get affected by inflammation. So if you're eating gluten, and in you, depending on what's going on in your body, it creates inflammation, it then shuts down energy production, which is obviously going to lead to a whole bunch of problems. So his stuff very much seemed to coincide the clearing up with removing the gluten.
Yes. Well, and there's a dichotomy of health advice from the level of, here are the basic things that you need to do so that you don't die tomorrow, and then
yes,
and that's that's the recommended daily allowance, right? And so it's just this is so that you don't get rickets and those types of problems. But if we're going to be performers, then our education about nutrition needs to be much better. One of my understandings is that not everyone is affected by glutens in the same way, that some people can actually consume them with no problem.
Yep.
Is that what, okay. So it's people who have the celiac problem and others too.
If you want me to put people to sleep. So there's celiac, which is an autoimmune disease, which is full blown, and then there's non-celiac gluten sensitivity, where it's not an autoimmune reaction where there's kind of the self-destruction, it's just an inflammatory response. And then there's a few other different types of response you can get as well. So my understanding of the science by a guy called Dr. Fasano is that the body can't fully break down gluten, it just can't be done. But how much that bothers people, there's a massive variance there. Like the intestinal walls open up and just kind of get rid of it. And in some people, they heal immediately, everything's fine, and they're not going to notice any ill effects ever by eating gluten. You've got celiacs being the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and then you've got, a whole spectrum in between where, some people get bothered a little bit. But when people look at something like gluten, they're normally judging it by digestive symptoms. But in the research, 60 to 70% of the reported problems are more, neurological. So pain and fatigue and anxiety and depression and those things. So often people maybe miss how their body's reacting something because they're looking for a digestive symptom, and it's something completely different going on. So, when you take gluten away from people, good things can happen sometimes, but not everyone.
Well, and, and there's nothing boring about your presentation there. That was, I mean, if you were saying, and then the still, so, your presentation made it really awesome. Now, but no, I think in general, though, I think in the West, people are not very in touch with what their bodies are doing and telling them. And so, I've been told by numerous health practitioners that I'm kind of like in the upper echelon of people who actually know what's happening, what their body's telling them. Hey, I'm having this little thing right here, and it feels like it's that, but and then they go, oh, well, I'll be darned. It's exactly as you said, or yes, I could see what you're reporting, but we happen to know that actually gets traced over here to this. You just are experiencing that. So I'm like, okay, fine. I just learned something new. So, it points to that we should stop and pay attention to, I ate this certain thing. Now I don't feel so great. I think also people are not aware of how much monosodium glutamate they consume. So this is something that's a sneaky thing, because when you see natural flavor, that's in the US, that is generally going to be monosodium glutamate. So my wife and I are very sensitive to that. And so if we've had something like that, then we get really thirsty and irritable and, upset stomach, tension in our gut. And so that's something that we pay attention to. So there's certain restaurants that we suspect use that, and then we don't go back. All right. So, we're kind of getting towards the end here. I'm faking it really good because I didn't have a very good night's sleep last night. So I'm ready to get off of this pretty quick. But why don't we kind of go back and just summarize what are, 1, 2, or 3 things that, reflecting back on this talk that you would like to have people take home with them?
I think the kind of the big take home for people, we just got a little bit deep and started talking about some other things, but training the visual system and training the vestibular system can be massively impactful in your tennis game really quickly. I kind of lump them in together just because they're so intricately connected. So we've just talked about some complicated stuff and parts of the brain and blah, blah, blah. What it comes down to is if you practice tracking things in different directions, it activates a bunch of stuff, and 5 minutes a day can massively help your ability to track the ball, to time the ball, to hit with consistency.
That's great. And, what is your Instagram? Because I see you doing some of these exercises on Instagram, so people can go there and mimic you.
Yeah, tennis.hacker is the Instagram. And there's also a YouTube channel as well, which is Tennis Hacker, which I'm starting to make a lot more content on now. But most of it's on Instagram, and the YouTube is slowly being built out, but it takes a little bit of time.
Yes, absolutely. I'm in that same business myself. And then, so what's another really good take home?
I think the thing that I really try and get across to tennis players is that you need to do other stuff. There's this growing trend in tennis where people are kind of breaking down professional tennis players' strokes and things like that and making it out like it's really easy. And maybe I'm just not as good as other people, but I never found tennis easy. I was quite a high-level athlete in a few different sports, but tennis is really hard. And to play it, you need to get your body working well enough to be able to do the advanced things that you see from these pro players. So really, what I always recommend to people is spend a little bit of additional time outside of the stuff that you do on court, whether it's injury prevention, whether it's the vision training, the vestibular training to get stuff working, and just use that to get your body able to do what you need it to do so you can play tennis in the way that you want. So that's what I always try and kind of get across to people.
Yeah, and on the other side of things, I think people come to it and they are nervous, upset, and worried and thinking that tennis is so incredibly difficult. So when I'm starting people out, I try to get them into their lowest possible anxiety state. I want them to be very relaxed and easygoing, and we're just going to toss the ball a little bit and make it very, very easy at first. And then we'll build out, and they'll need more athleticism as we make it more challenging. So, yes, as you progress, definitely you've got to add more things to your training to give you a wider variety of skills. Absolutely. All right. So, final thought.
Final thought.
A final thought. This is your last thought.
So I think
So
maybe the final.
you didn't know that the end was going to come so soon.
The final thought: train your visual system. If you play tennis, it will make a big difference.
All right, Richard. Hey, it was a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, likewise.
And to get to know you some, and I look forward to our next chat. I think I would like to keep this conversation going, and try to. I want to learn as much from you as I can, because this is going to be definitely going to help with the development of the 5th edition of Visual Training for Tennis. So anyway, thanks for coming on.
Great to chat.
Enjoy your evening. And if people want to reach out to you, it's tennis.hacker on Instagram, and then also Tennis Hacker on YouTube.
Yep, Tennis Hacker on YouTube, or just email me, Richard at Tennis Hacker. Any of those will work, and I'll get back to people pretty quickly.
All right, very good. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill.
Take care. All right, thank you, Richard. Bye-bye.